Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Dr. Emmanuel Igwe. So, Dr. Igwe, you are a senior research official at the Prosperity Institute in the United Kingdom, and you and your co-author published an interesting report. I read all of it, all 72 pages. Well, some of it, are footnotes, etc. And it is titled A Road to Nowhere: Why the UK EU Reset is Not the Answer. For those of us who don't know, tell us about Brexit briefly.
Yes. First of all, Lipton, it's a pleasure and an honor to be on your podcast. Thank you for having me. And so, Brexit is an outcome that came as a result of a referendum to leave the EU. So, Brexit is a short form for Britain's exit. So, back in May 2016, Britain decided to leave the EU, and from that moment henceforth, it's been proceeding out of the EU. But that's a short answer. There is a longer answer, but that's a short one.
That's okay. That's good enough. I'm sure that by now most people are familiar with the idea of Brexit. And for those who did not know, what you have said is enough. So, Emmanuel, some people have been saying that Brexit was an error and that the British economy is declining due to Brexit. I don't buy that argument. I read Dr. Lyons and I've been following the data. What are your views? Are we doing badly because of Brexit?
So, the people that make the argument that Brexit has led to economic decline make it from the precedent that Britain's trade economic activity is broadly dependent on its relationship with the EU. And what I show in my report is that, in fact, first of all, Britain is diverting its relationship with the EU from a trade perspective, but then also as well, the major effects, whatever we are experiencing in our economy, has largely been as a result of domestic regulations. So whether we think about the effects of the post-COVID economic policies, or more recently, the current administration's economic policies. So those better explainers of Britain's current economic situation than the event of initially leaving the EU and fundamentally signing it in 2020.
All right. In the beginning of your report, you noted that internal regulations are more important to British growth than Brexit. And again, I'm agreeing, not for the sake of agreeing, but because I do know that England has a regulatory problem. What type of regulations do you propose for England? Because when people say that regulations are a problem, they're usually fuzzy. So, give an example of a regulation that should be retired or a regulation that should be reformed.
Um, on a grand scale, I believe that a broad portfolio that repeals EU law would be a huge start, because it undoes a lot of the regulatory procedures that have been adopted into British law, which have been predominantly redundant because Britain is no longer in the EU and no longer has to comply with those regulations. So a grand sweep of EU law would be a very good step.
Yes, that's what you said. Exercise the powers in the retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Act 2023 to remove from British legislation any EU imposed regulations that do not serve British economic interest, thereby restoring a common law principles based and outcome based approach. I agree. The European Union is a regulatory body. EU is that's a slow growth place. Despite the quality of its institution and human capital, it's underperforming. It's a slow growth place. A few countries by themselves can't propel the EU, and that's why I supported Brexit. We saw Brexit and England did not implode. Why is England having a problem? Because of internal regulations. It's too hard to build.
Yeah, indeed. The frustration with the argument that says, "Oh, Britain should reset, realign with the EU," is that the EU as an economic bloc has been experiencing consistent decline since 1991. Its share as a proportion of global GDP is currently at 16.5%, I believe it is. And that has been a consistent decline all the way through the 90s and into the current millennium. So the argument that says that Britain should align itself with a declining economy when on the flip side you have emerging economies across East Asia, we have the United States that are more willing to trade with us. I think it's a ludicrous proposal.
What's Britain's trade like with the non-EU world?
Britain's trade with non-EU countries has been on the ascendancy. So, what happened, I believe, at the initial years of Britain leaving the EU, there was there was a little bit of a, would I say, there was a little bit of an upsurge in trade with the EU as against the non-EU countries. And that was in large part just because people were anticipating what could potentially happen when there is a final agreement in place. So, to give a context, the Brexit happens in 2016, but that does not imply that Britain automatically has left the EU. What then happens is over a couple of years, Parliament then decides how it is going to enact its agenda to leave the EU. Now that gets clarified by 2020, just before COVID. Now, in the years preceding this decision, called the Trade and Cooperation Agreement in 2020, what happened was there's a little bit of an upsurge in trade with the EU. Just in a sense, people just being uncertain. You could imagine businesses just being uncertain. But in the years following the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, also called the TCA, the levels have dipped a little bit, whilst the trade with foreign countries have grown exponentially. So what was I won't say exponentially, I beg your pardon, but it has grown uh, by a huge margin. So what we're seeing is call it a replacement, call it Britain being able to have more flexibility in its trading abilities, and we will talk about that later on. But in essence, the proportion of trade going to non-EU countries is increasing, whilst that going um, to EU is reducing. To give you a particular statistic that would help. Back in the year 2000, Britain traded about 52% of its trades with the EU. As of 2024, that has gone down to 41. So that is a decline of over 10%. So that gives you some insight into the nature of trend shift.
All right. What is the trade intensity index, and also tell us about the trade complementarity index?
Okay, so these are two measures that our trade analysts use to explore how a country trades with neighbors, with other countries, etc. Now, what trade intensity does is it basically tries to compare a country's trade with another country versus that country's trade with the rest of the world. So that is what it does. So in other words, we're trying to say, does Britain trade so much with the EU, or does it trade so much with the rest of the world? Now, what we see in a sense is that the funny thing about the post-Brexit, the Brexit narrative is that we like to think that somehow the fall in the trade with the EU um, has been overwhelming in terms of it has been a total collapse. However, the reality is that Britain has sustained a fairly amicable trade relationship with the EU, despite the potential for compliance costs and regulatory burden. But then also as well, it has, in its own little way, tried to navigate beyond that relationship with the EU. So you see on the graphs that it has maintained a fairly standard trade intensity with the EU. I believe oscillating between 1% and 2% at different points. On the other end, trade complementarity index is basically trying to say how much of a country's import demand is satisfied by another country's exports. So, in other words, if we look at the EU as seeking a particular set of of goods that may come from Britain, to what extent is it that British manufacturers are able to meet up with that demand? Now, oftentimes there are different factors, just similar to the intensity situation. Compliance costs play a huge factor, for instance. What we see here is that, in spite of all of these roadblocks, not to say that everyone advocates for roadblocks, but just to say that the scaremongering that came with the Remain camp, saying that there'll be no ability to trade with the EU, is debunked just by understanding that consistently Britain has been able to trade with the EU, meeting a good proportion of the expected demand from the EU, from the UK. So what we see across all of those years are over 90% plus levels of complementarity with the EU. And I think that is remarkable.
I think that the UK should exploit its relationship with America. Donald Trump is an opportunity for the UK, and for a simple reason. Donald Trump loves the royal family.
Yes.
Donald Trump is, yeah, he's sentimental about the elite class in the UK. He likes the royal family. England should not become a republic, and the UK should exploit the social capital of the royal family by engaging Donald Trump in more serious business partnerships, especially in AI. The UK can learn so much from America in terms of deregulation. I've been repeating myself for some time now. People don't know this, but the quality of science in the UK is superior. The problem is commercialization. The UK still has some of the best researchers and some of the best students, but Americans excel at commercialization. They bring the product to market. And if you want to bring the product to market, you need effective regulations. I propose the liberal model of regulation rather than the punitive model. If the UK follows the American path to innovation, it will do well.
Yeah, and we could say a lot about that. So, sometime towards the end of last year, loads of work was being put ahead, at least especially as President Trump was coming into office, to try to create or reestablish um, a trade relationship with the US. And what has come as a result of that have been two major deals. The first being the Economic Prosperity Deal, which was signed I want to say, I believe March or April it was earlier this year. And that was just a broad statement of commitment to Britain from the United States, which is very interesting. But then fast forward to only, I believe, just last month when President Trump came to Britain again. And in this time around, he brought in major tech giants to sign
Yes.
a prosperity.
Nvidia.
Yeah, indeed. And that was going to bring a total of about 150 billion US dollars, of which 40 billion in itself would go into um, creation of data centers, work on artificial intelligence and digital services. So there is a lot of scope for trade with the United States, and I make the proposal that it would be in Britain's best interest to create a full free trade agreement with the United States. Now, the reason why this is also possible now in comparison to the past was, if we remember back in the early 2000s, there was the what we called a TTIP, which was sort of a transatlantic trade partnership, which was an agreement on in process. And unfortunately, it never materialized, especially because of the many factions in place from the EU who would ask several questions of the United States. And eventually, the United States pulled out. Britain was all in for it, but sadly, a lot of its EU counterparts were not fully sold on the idea for different reasons, and that was how that deal died. Now, Britain is free from the tentacles of the EU. It can actually make a free trade agreement on its own merit, and I would say definitely yes. We should proceed for that. And to make a shameless plug, a friend of mine, Catherine McBride, writes a very
I
interesting
read her.
report on how this could potentially be the case. So yeah,
Yeah, I've read it. Catherine McBride. She was responding to some of the pro Brexit people. Yeah,
indeed,
the UK is a rich country. Free trade is good, but you can have free trade without being a part of the EU.
yes.
You don't need to be a globalist to believe in globalization. Globalization and globalism are two different concepts. You can be pro free trade, pro market, and even pro immigration and not be a globalist. You can even believe in liberal humanitarianism and not be a globalist.
Exactly. So these are some things that are worth stating, that one does not need to be within some kind of political bloc to be able to achieve free trade ideals. So if we remember, the EU started off initially as a kind of economic bloc, predominantly economic and trade bloc. So just to facilitate trade, but over decades, it has morphed into this political vehicle where the rights of individuals are being either curtailed or exercised in different ways by an entity that is far removed and far divorced from their daily lives. So yes, we could actually enact free trade principles, which is what we're doing right now, signing up to 70 plus free trade agreements without having to be within the regulatory orbit that is the European Union.
So I'm from Jamaica, and Jamaica's CARICOM. In the Caribbean, regional integration is often promoted as a Republican policy in the sense that we are deviating from independence on the Western world. So we are starting our own institution to prove that we're independent and serious. But regional integration is colonial. The British, since the 17th century, were proposing regional integration to reduce the administrative liability of managing colonies. And in Jamaica, some countries breach the rules of CARICOM. They impose tariffs or they don't amend their laws to reflect CARICOM's realities. Furthermore, CARICOM doesn't have a serious business or scientific project. It's not as effective as the EU at enforcement, and it lacks serious scientific and business organizations. But there is UE, CXC, and some health bodies. And I think that for Jamaica, leaving CARICOM would be ideal, but that's going to be a bit difficult because of CXC and UE. So I don't think we're going to leave, but we should just scale back. You don't need to be a part of any regional bloc to engage in free trade or to do business. And regional integration, just like the EU, is a form of protectionism because countries who are not a party to the treaty, they face tariffs. Their goods don't enter duty free. So that's not really free trade, that's just protectionism.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot speak specifically to CARICOM because I must admit I'm not fully versed on sort of
But
the
you're from
intricacies of
Africa.
how it works.
You could talk
But,
about Africa.
but in general, any sort of so-called block that is designed to impose upon member states how it ought to do business and trade that does not involve a liberating factor. So what do I mean by this? So um, if your trading bloc is asking you to impose on certain levels of tariffs or tax levels, etc., in other words, imposing upon you policy, then there is a concern. That is an external body superseding the will of the people, the demos, to influence change in nation states. So obviously we don't need to be geniuses to think of the constitutional implications that has. So yes, I would say definitely if it means to scale back or ultimately to leave CARICOM to maintain or restore national sovereignty, and maintain a sense of economic liberty, then definitely I'll propose yes, do that.
Exactly, because I read the earpiece and I'm on page what 35, and there's a subheading: how would the EU industrial policy conflict with British manufacturing priorities? You mentioned the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism imposing reporting requirements on carbon intensive imports. Why does that even matter? Why would England embed itself in such a legislation?
And this is this is one of those pesky, frustrating aspects of the reset agenda that to an external person listening in would be baffled. But for the regulators of the current administration, they believe that this is essential towards achieving net zero targets, towards, in a sense, joining this kind of global coalition towards achieving climate change objectives. So, now to give more context, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, at the heart of it is what we call the emissions trading scheme, which is a way of being able to put a price tag on how much carbon is emitted due to manufacturing processes. Now, in Britain right now, the value I believe is, and now this value changes obviously due to daily rates, etc. But I believe it's about £41. The EU value is about 65 pounds. So Britain, adjusting to the EU's emissions trading scheme, in a sense, would actually increase the amount of money that manufacturers pay for carbon emissions. And to make things even doubly worse, by 2027, the EU intends on expanding the scope of this emissions trading scheme to cover all manner of infrastructure development. So think about road construction, railway constructions, which currently do not have to deal with this kind of embargo. So this is what we are seeing here. So I mean, it doesn't make any sense from a logically thinking person why you would want to subject the average individual to more taxes or to a higher price on carbon emissions. But to these regulators and to these people who wish to be in this cabal, it is that means towards the end, which is achieving net zero targets, achieving climate change objectives. So that's where we are right now, which is really, really sad.
It is. And the EU does not believe in permissionless innovation.
Yeah, yeah.
As you mentioned in your paper. So that's a term that an American economist coined, permissionless innovation. They believe in precautions, even if
Oh,
the
yeah.
precaution is not scientific.
Yes, it is this sense within the EU that is really um, that really strives to be, in a way, avoidant of risk. So there's this whole risk avoidance mindset within the EU that says, despite the scientific impetus for a particular piece of innovation, for instance, it would be best if we look at what governance has to say. We've seen very silly stories like importation of basmati rice from India, having to fulfill particular criterion of nutritional value, when in India that rice is perfectly legit and fine to eat. Um, uh, the list goes on. So is this a mindset of risk avoidance in the EU that is antithetical to innovation? And that is what is at risk for Britain. Britain is a very innovative country.
It is.
Going back, sorry,
I said it is.
yeah. So
Like
going back
I'm
to
an immigrant and I love the UK. I really like the UK.
indeed, there is so much to be thankful for. We talked about AI earlier. A major pioneer of AI was British.
Yes.
So these are things that we shouldn't forget so quickly.
And Tim Berners-Lee, is he also from the UK?
Yeah, he
Sir
is.
Tim
Yes,
Berners-Lee. Yeah, and then whenever people want to say that they are conducive to investment, do you know what they do? Even when they are not British, they say we have the British common law. Even
indeed.
no, even in 2025, that's what they do. In the Middle East, they say, okay, we have a court, we have the British common law.
Yeah, yes, and these are some of the reasons why staying out of the EU is beneficial to Britain, in the sense that over generations, Britain has set itself as the gold standard for various industrial practices, whether we think of the financial markets, we think
You know,
of legal
Emmanuel,
practice.
you're so bright. I keep telling people England sets the standard for institutional development. Even today, with the regulatory sandbox and the new stock exchange for private businesses, that's just British genius.
Indeed, indeed, and just very simple ideas like regulatory sandboxes, which are, in other words, just ways of being able to cushion out particular sectors from the harmful events of just taxation, allowing them to thrive as incubator hubs. It's a marvelous idea that can only be properly enforced without any kind of incumbent policies from elsewhere, like the EU, for instance.
And the British They invented the regulatory sandbox and it has become global. Other countries have it. In
Yeah,
Jamaica, there is a regulatory sandbox for fintech, but I don't know what's going on with the fintech sector in Jamaica. The regulatory sandboxes are usually successful, but probably the issue is that in Jamaica, probably we don't have the fintech talent.
I mean,
I did some research because I wanted to know if the sandbox was effective at generating businesses, and I couldn't name a single business that emerged from the sandbox successfully. So I guess the issue could be a human capital problem. Probably the finance or the tech people who were in the sandbox in Jamaica are just not that good.
yeah, I mean, with the regulatory sandboxes, I mean, ideally, we want to lower taxes across the board. That is the truth. But regulatory sandboxes as an incubator hub for innovative ideas is at least what I say a happy medium. Um, Now, I cannot speak to the effectiveness of various forms of regulatory sandboxes, whether if it's a medical device regulation or creation, I beg your pardon, or whether if we're looking at fintech. However, just conventionally speaking, when you think of from a theoretical standpoint, it should be expected that if you allow a business to thrive without any major hindrances from regulatory authorities, then just naturally free market principles apply. Um, you know, such businesses should be able to flourish, and in a way, you can actually be able to appreciate the full potential of such businesses. Because what happens when you do not have that kind of, would I say, incubator box, that kind of regulatory sandbox, is that it may be more difficult to actually observe the potential pitfalls that a sector could have, to see the areas where that particular sector thrives. So it's almost like without any kind of activities that could whereas to upset the scales of progress in a particular sector.
Now we're going to talk about the product regulation and standards, non-tariff barriers to trade.
Yes.
What is this about? What's a non-tariff barrier to trade? For those who don't know.
So we understand. I think everybody has had to dust off their macro and microeconomic textbooks in the past. In the past year, as we've heard a lot more about tariffs in the past year than we've had in at least the past decade. Um, what tariff simply does in general, before we go to non-trade barriers, is uh, a president or Donald Trump, let's use that example because it's what we see these days. Donald Trump says on steel, on whatever kind of good or service, we are going to ensure that a country pays a certain kind of embargo if you were to export that particular good into the United States. That is a fair understanding. That is objectively determined. So we can see that happen. We can see the amount of money, the percentage that will be applied to the cost of your import, etc. is understood. Now, non-trade barriers, on the other hand, are more, slightly more complex in the sense that what it does is through regulatory practice, we see protectionist measures that come up and make it more difficult for businesses to trade
Yeah.
with other parties. So, you know, we could take as a very simple example, you're talking about the sort of product standards and metrology as an example. Now, what that does in Britain is you are essentially trying to determine in certain ways how particular products should be packaged, how they should be distributed, and if you do not comply with those kinds of external standards, not even your own domestic standards. Now we're talking about external standards. Then you cannot trade with them. Or you cannot trade with them. Now that is we could manage that from a sovereignty basis. So every country has the right to impose whatever kind of regulations on what can come into its country, and that's fine. However, um, in Britain, this Product Standards and Metrology Act basically, in an insidious manner, ties Britain's manufacturing process of many goods and services, particularly goods, to EU prescribed standards. So, one that often frustrates me is the idea of bottle openers, on whether we look at our Coca-Cola bottles, etc., and that recent thing where you cannot fully take off the full top because for whatever reason. Now that is an inheritance of this compliance to EU legislation, for instance. So that is just a very simple example of a non-trade barrier. So that just makes business slightly bit harder for no reason and no added value whatsoever.
I think people are too driven by sentiment. Are you? Do you have a degree in science? Do you have any degree in science?
So
Science.
do
Do
I
you have any
have?
degree? A degree in science?
No, I don't. No, I don't have a degree in science. No,
None at all. Neither
my
do
degree
I.
is in
Neither do I. I didn't do science beyond the high school, but I read because climate change is always in the news and we have to be informed. People talk about climate change and carbon dioxide. So they should tell us what is the social cost of carbon. If they
yeah.
can't answer, why should we listen to them? That part of the debate is never brought to the forefront by the media. And I've read William Happer, I read Pat Michaels of Cato and CI. Pat died a few years ago. And they say that the social cost of carbon is in our favor. There are more carbon has more benefits than disadvantages. So the social cost is negative.
Yeah, I mean, right now, Britain contributes about 0.8% of global CO2 emissions if we are to take sort of internationally proven estimates as, guaranteed. Um, Oftentimes, when we have this conversation about climate change, it is often perceived to encompass both measures to avert so-called man-made climate change issues, but also as well elements of um, taking care of our environment. Now, the reality is that there is a distinction between the two. Now, I believe personally that it's very important that we take care of our environment, that we do our best to be able to keep our society, our environment looking beautiful. So this would be through like planting like trees, for instance, or um, just picking up litter on the floor, stuff like that. Now that I think are practical ways that we could actually make our environments look better. Now, when we talk about the conversation on climate change, in other words, all of these very interesting things are, are often being proposed. I say, for us to be able to reduce CO2 emissions, we need to adopt X, Y, and Z type of um, technology, and most of this technology are heavily subsidized by the taxpayer. And in reality, one could question their viability as standalone products in the open market. So when you have these kinds of narratives of yes uh, of climate change, no one is really asking, okay, yes, even if we were to propose all of this technology, how much is it costing the taxpayer to implement, for instance? That's a question that one should genuinely ask. But we don't.
And if you pose that question, you're not a climate denier. People don't deny that the climate is changing. Of course, the climate is changing. It is always changing.
Indeed, the climate is always changing. And just as I mentioned when we talk about taking care of our environment, there are simple things that one could do to just simply be a good steward of the resources that we have. Um, One does not have to therefore go to the point of penalizing other people for not following your position on how to take care of the environment, because then that becomes a little bit selfish, doesn't it?
Now I want to talk about a touchy topic. Gene editing. You say the repeal of the Genetic Technology Precision Breeding Act of 2023, which legalized gene editing in the UK. So if the UK decides to harmonize its food regulation to make them in alignment with the EU, plant genetic editing, that might become illegal, and that's going to slow down innovation in agriculture.
Yes.
But why is this even a debate?
Or why is it a debate?
Yeah, why is gene editing even a debate?
Now, in and of itself, that may not be, when I say the most pressing or most concerning aspect of a reset with the EU, but it alludes to this element of stifling innovation that comes as a result of being a member of the EU. So now, regardless of whatever anyone's stance is on gene editing, the critical thing is, at least within the context of Britain, gene editing has been instrumental towards efficiency in crop manufacture, or in the agri-food industry, livestock farming, for instance. And Britain has made, in the years since leaving the EU, there have been tremendous progress made just because the regulations have been relaxed, because we've been able to create very airtight policies that enhance this kind of production. Now, coming back to the EU, what is would Britain would have to comply with the way the EU wishes to proceed with gene editing. So a lot of the processes that we have right now will be scaled back. So think about the regulatory nightmare of having to tell research labs, farmers, etc., that all of these new policies, which we've just released in the past 2 or 3 years, would have to be scaled back just because we want to be in parity with what is going on in the rest of the EU. Think about the legislative nightmare, but also as well think about the practical nightmare for businesses up and down the country.
Exactly, and the Americans, they are more advanced in gene editing, even when it comes to the human genome. Because I have a colleague within the gene editing business, human genome and genetic screening, and he was saying to me that in the UK, some aspects of that is not. No, this is what he said. He said that it is not legal in the UK. So he's interested in polygenic testing and PGS scores and diseases and cognitive ability. And he was explaining to me that in the UK, that's not really allowed. I should do more research. But in America, you can start a gene editing business, and we're talking about the human genome. Yeah, which I also think that that should be allowed, because I look at gene editing as a test bed for biology. You sponsor gene editing, you learn more about humans and plants and animals. We learn how to solve diseases and how to treat them. So I am in favor of gene editing. I don't think it's plain divine maker. I think that God wants us to use science to solve these problems.
I mean, in
Do
many
you
ways,
have any personal opinion on gene editing, whether it be plants or animals or anything like that, or
I mean,
human beings?
I'm fairly supportive of it because we think about the amount of plants that unfortunately are not able to be properly harvested or cultivated due to a lack of knowledge in the past, which has been totally changed due to the advancements in gene editing. Um, some of the most impressive findings from Scotland, on how to make up food crops like bananas, in a sense, last a little longer, so that it can actually be able to overcome the strain of logistics going across continents. Because oftentimes what would happen with bananas, especially, is you harvest banana on a Monday, by Thursday it's already totally gone. How do you ensure that you can actually be able to plant natural organic bananas that could be transported across, over a limited period of time, and you could still have at least a good product to consume at the other end, a continent or two away. So stuff like that are helpful, and basically it's all part of, the process of human growth. Think about what storage systems in the past did for ancient people, and so on and so forth.
Now we're going to talk about financial services in the UK and the section in your paper addressing EU harmonization and financial services. England has a comparative and a competitive advantage in finance. Why?
So there are a few reasons. First of all, um, you know, I'm often reminded of something I heard from someone who said, if you want to make money, go to New York. If you want to keep money, go to London. And the reason why they say so is that the first of all, the surrounding legislative infrastructure, plus the nature of the city and Canary Wharf, but then also as well the historic heritage that London holds, being in a very good time zone. All of these things contribute to a very robust, very dynamic financial sector. So those are some of the simple comparative advantages that are not easily gained by, say, by Paris, or wherever you may find it in other key EU cities, as an example.
And London was the original international financial center.
Indeed, indeed,
And then there's
yes,
the city of London, which has been independent for several centuries. Many people outside of England are not familiar with the peculiar state of the city of London.
yeah,
So,
absolutely. And there's a lot that could be said about about the dynamic nature of our financial industries that, um, in a sense, could be curtailed by resetting back into the EU. Because what happens when Britain chooses to reset, to dynamically realign with the EU, if we were to adopt a financial rules? Because now, admittedly, the EU reset does not particularly put a major punishment on the financial sector yet, but there is a scope for that in the future if you go down this path. Now, if you had to make that analogy, of so we could think of a host of derivatives and acts that the EU has since implemented, which would make it more difficult to transact in open market for British financial industry. And in a season where right now the financial sector is experiencing its own fair share of upheaval. Rejoining the EU would add an extra layer of complexity to whatever the current health of the financial sector.
But Rachel Reeves, the minister, she has not encouraged billionaires to stay in the UK. Many of them are leaving. That doesn't have anything to do with the EU. So, strangely, not the European Union, the United Kingdom has become its own recipe for disaster. Why would you want some of the wealthiest people in the world to flee with their capital out of London?
Now, I cannot speak to the sort of to the motives or intentions of
Yeah, we don't know that, but it's just strange.
it is strange, and this is these are aspects of your policy making that unless if you're the party in government and looking at the spreadsheet, one cannot fully understand why you would particularly proceed with a set of policies one way or the other. Now, what we could say is now the current administration has been in power for the better part of a year and 4 months thereabouts, and unfortunately, a series of policies that it has taken, where we think about the announcements in the last autumn statement, for instance, have led to counterproductive outcomes. So now, why is that the case? Maybe it's the tools available to them. I cannot give a genuine sort of rationale, but but we know for in general that at least I've written an op-eds in the past arguing against an increase in employers' national insurance as an example. So, but then we see what happens when employers' national insurance increases, and then we begin to see a brain drain and a flight of wealth from Britain.
Well, Emmanuel, I again, I'm not arguing for the sake of agreeing. I think we're on the same page. We're both pro market. I don't support employment, and I don't support unemployment and insurance for various reasons. One, it does delay employment. So if you're a beneficiary, you're less likely to apply for jobs. And two, it's costly for the state and the employer who is funding it if it has an employer contribution. I think that when you become an employee, this should be done everywhere. Well, not everywhere. It all depends on the financial structure. But I think what's more feasible is to allow the employee to pay a greater burden. So he or she can opt into an employee into an employee insurance scheme. There can be an employer contribution, and he has a contribution. And if he is unemployed, he gets back the money. I don't think the government should be involved in this. And if we can find a way to lower the burden for the employer, we should also do so. It's just like pension. We don't need to raise the pension age. We need to follow countries with better pension systems like Singapore, Sweden, and have people pay for their pensions. Pay and invest. You pay for, like in Sweden, people invest in the stock market because of the pension system is structured. When you become up when you invest into the pension fund, a percentage is also allotted to investments elsewhere in the market, in stock market. So I think that should be the template. You work, you pay for yourself.
I uh, a lot of that, I agree with, and one could argue about the rationale behind the national insurance, why it came into existence, how functional is it today, and And there are various frustrations that come with that argument. Um, at the very least, the important thing to note is in the current administration, they chose to increase that for employers, and obviously that had a detrimental effect on their ability to employ more people because if you're spending more of your money paying extra taxes, then you're not necessarily going to have enough to hire new people. um, that also has an implication on incentives that an employer may give to current employees to work harder because that is also based on the amount of profit he may have after all costs have been um, settled. So the point also about pension, yes, there is huge scope for pension reform. We agree that the current structure, whether we think about a triple lock, whether we think about the nature of state pensions, all of these are issues that genuinely need to be redressed in a way that makes it simpler. So examples could be aspects of, say, um, redressing the triple log such that you can only consider one aspect out of inflation, wage growth, and 2.5%, whichever one choose your pick as a starting point, for instance. And you mentioned some of the stuff in places like Hong Kong and Sweden, and perhaps one may want to look into some of the benefits one could take out of those countries to encourage better planning structures for pensions.
Yes, it's well, we're not in politics. Politics is complicated,
We're not
but
politicians,
yeah, people
okay.
in politics are usually not stupid. They're usually smart. At least they should be. But it is populism. Like I just don't know why people find it so difficult to pay for themselves. Like when I was back in Jamaica working, I really wish that we had a system where I was allowed to pay for myself. Like there was pension reform. So with pension reform, you would pay your pension. There's a government contribution, but I would have preferred a system where all workers had the option to choose a private provider. So you can choose a private provider and also pay a government pension at the same time. I would have well, you can do it, but but for you to do it, you'd have to go to an office and get it done. And Jamaica is really bureaucratic. You'd have to get a number of different papers and speak to notary publics and just annoying. So that's why I did not get a second pension when I was in Jamaica. I couldn't be bothered to go to an office to speak to somebody or to get any signature from a notary public. I would have preferred to just show somebody my ID, my tax number, and start to pay into the fund. So like most people usually talk about what the government should do to help them. Okay, I have kids. I want my kids to go to college. I want a job. Those issues don't bother me. I want the government to make it easy for me to do business. Yeah, help me to help myself. Yeah, that's what I want. Just help me to help myself. That's the only thing I want from the government. And I think that these days we speak frequently about what the government should do, but what about the responsibilities of the citizen? We only have rights these days, no responsibilities. It was a pleasure and thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's been an honor and a delight. And yes,
All right.
thank you.